Major Supreme Court decisions often feel sudden not because the law changes overnight, but because long-running debates about judicial power finally come to a head. When the court rules, it does more than resolve a single dispute. It defines how authority is exercised across the legal system and clarifies who can enforce constitutional limits, when, and for whom. A recent emergency ruling illustrates this dynamic in a particularly stark way. Issued without oral arguments and through the court's expedited process, the decision arose from litigation tied to an executive order concerning birthright citizenship, yet the court used that case as a vehicle to resolve a much broader procedural conflict that has been quietly reshaping federal courts for decades. To understand why this ruling matters, it helps to set aside political outcomes and focus instead on a narrower but powerful question. When judges review a challenged law, how far does their authority extend while the case is still pending? For roughly the past 25 years, federal courts have increasingly relied on what are known as nationwide or universal injunctions. These orders allowed a single district judge to temporarily block enforcement of a federal or state policy across the entire country, even if the lawsuit before the court involved only a small number of plaintiffs. In practical terms, one judge could halt a regulation everywhere while the legal challenge moved through the system. This tool became common in disputes involving immigration enforcement, healthcare mandates, environmental regulations, firearm rules, workplace standards, and election procedures. A case filed in one judicial district could effectively freeze a policy in all 50 states. As you follow this explanation, it helps to keep one distinction in mind: the difference between resolving a specific dispute between named parties and issuing relief that governs how the government treats everyone else. The Supreme Court's emergency ruling brought that practice to a decisive stop. By a 6-3 vote, the court concluded that federal judges lack the authority to issue injunctions that protect people who are not parties to the lawsuit. Writing for the majority, Justice Amy Coney Barrett grounded the decision in the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the federal court system. According to the majority, that statute authorized courts to decide concrete disputes between specific litigants, not to impose nationwide limits on government action. In the court's view, lower courts had gradually expanded their remedial powers beyond what the Constitution and early federal law permitted. Rather than acting solely as arbiters of individual cases, judges were increasingly functioning as policymakers with national reach. The ruling rejected that evolution and reasserted what the majority described as the proper boundary of judicial power. Several concurring opinions expanded on this reasoning by turning to historical practice. Justice Gorsuch, in an extensive concurrence, traced judicial decisions from the late 18th century through the 19th century to argue that early federal courts consistently confined relief to the parties before them. When litigants sought orders blocking enforcement of laws against the public at large, judges routinely refused, explaining that their authority extended only to the dispute presented. One example involved a merchant who asked a court to stop enforcement of a federal tariff, not just against himself, but against everyone subject to it. The judge declined, stating that judicial power did not reach that far. Justice Gorsuch cited such examples to support the claim that nationwide injunctions are not rooted in long-standing American legal tradition, but are instead a modern development. Justice Thomas, writing separately, reinforced this historical argument while emphasizing structural concerns. He described universal injunctions as a procedural innovation that encourages forum shopping, the practice of seeking out a favorable judge or jurisdiction to secure a broad policy outcome. From this perspective, Article 3 of the Constitution, which limits courts to deciding cases and controversies, imposes a natural constraint on judicial remedies. Courts, in this view, may grant relief only to parties who demonstrate actual injuries, not issue broad directives affecting millions of people who are not before the court. As you consider these arguments, it is useful to focus on how the justices frame the role of courts themselves, not just the policies at issue. The dissenting justices took a sharply different approach. Writing in opposition, they argued that broad injunctions have long been essential tools for addressing systemic constitutional violations. According to the dissent, limiting relief to named plaintiffs creates a fragmented system of justice in which rights are protected unevenly based on geography and access to legal resources. They warned that under the new framework, a policy that is plainly unlawful could remain in effect for months or years against everyone except the individuals who manage to sue. In their view, this undermines the principle that constitutional protections apply equally. The dissent pointed to historical civil rights litigation, where sweeping court orders were used to dismantle discriminatory systems rather than provide piecemeal relief. Although the majority acknowledged the importance of those outcomes, it maintained that procedural correctness cannot be set aside. even when the underlying goal is widely supported. This disagreement reflects a deeper tension about whether courts exist primarily to resolve individual disputes or to serve as a broader check on unlawful government action. Beyond theory, the ruling has immediate and concrete consequences. At the time the decision was issued, dozens of nationwide injunctions were actively shaping federal policy. Many of those orders now face revision or elimination as lower courts reassess their scope. Attorneys general across multiple states have already filed emergency motions either seeking to preserve existing injunctions or arguing that previously blocked laws should now take effect. Immigration enforcement has emerged as one of the first areas affected. Policies that were once halted nationwide may now be enforceable everywhere except against the specific plaintiffs who sued. This creates the possibility that enforcement practices will vary widely depending on location, even within the same state. It may be helpful to pause here and consider how a change in remedies, rather than a change in substantive law, can quickly alter conditions on the ground. Similar complexities are unfolding in other policy areas. Firearm regulations that were previously blocked nationwide while courts considered their legality may now be enforced against individuals not covered by the original lawsuits. This means that practical access to certain rights could change simply by crossing a state line, not because a legislature acted, but because the geographic reach of an injunction has narrowed. Healthcare policy presents equally intricate scenarios. Cases involving abortion medication, gender-related health care, contraceptive coverage, and religious exemptions often relied on broad injunctions to maintain uniform access during litigation. Under the new framework, access to certain medical services could depend on whether a patient or provider falls within the scope of a particular court order. Telehealth services, which operate across state lines, face particular uncertainty as providers navigate differing enforcement rules. Environmental regulation and employment law further illustrate the ripple effects. Federal agencies have operated under multiple injunctions blocking enforcement of rules related to air quality, water standards, and climate policy. If those injunctions are limited geographically, environmental protections may apply unevenly across the country, creating compliance challenges for companies and uncertainty for communities. Employment regulations governing overtime pay, workplace safety, contractor classification, and anti-discrimination protections have also been subject to nationwide orders. Employers with operations in multiple states may now face different federal requirements depending on location. As you follow these examples, notice how the ruling does not rewrite statutes, but reshapes how they are applied while litigation proceeds. Election administration may present the most acute challenges. At the time of the decision, multiple injunctions were affecting voting rules in numerous states. These orders addressed voter identification requirements, mail-in ballot procedures, registration deadlines, early voting periods, and district maps. Under the previous system, a court finding a constitutional problem could halt enforcement statewide. Under the new framework, relief may be limited to specific counties or groups of voters. This raises the prospect of different election rules operating simultaneously within the same state. Election administrators may be required to manage varying ballots, procedures, and deadlines, depending on which voters are covered by which court orders. Organizations responsible for administering elections have warned that this creates serious logistical challenges and risks undermining public confidence. As you think through these implications, it helps to distinguish between legal uniformity in theory and uniformity in practice. The economic consequences are also substantial. Businesses that operate across multiple states have long relied on nationwide injunctions to gain clarity when challenging federal regulations. A single order could suspend enforcement across all operations, allowing companies to plan accordingly. Without that option, businesses may need to comply with different regulatory regimes in different jurisdictions or pursue multiple lawsuits to achieve similar relief. Law firms have warned clients that litigation costs could rise dramatically as plaintiffs are forced to file cases in numerous courts. Industries such as banking, technology, healthcare, and pharmaceuticals face particular uncertainty. Regulations governing data privacy, lending practices, drug approvals, and marketing restrictions may now be enforceable in some regions but not others. As you consider these concerns, it becomes clear how procedural rules can shape economic behavior just as powerfully as substantive law. Underlying all of these effects is a broader shift in how the Supreme Court is exercising its authority. The decision was issued through the court's emergency docket, a process designed to address urgent matters without full briefing or oral argument. In recent years, the court has increasingly used this mechanism to resolve high-stakes questions, often with limited explanation. Critics argue that this leaves lower courts uncertain about how to apply the court's reasoning in future cases, creating hesitation and inconsistency. Supporters argue that emergency intervention is sometimes necessary to prevent irreparable harm and to correct errors quickly. In this instance, the use of the emergency docket to announce a sweeping change in remedial authority has intensified debate about transparency, precedent, and institutional role. It is worth listening closely to how process shapes perception, especially when decisions alter long-standing judicial practices. The ruling also raises fundamental questions about how rights are enforced. For decades, broad injunctions served as a primary mechanism for addressing systemic violations, allowing courts to halt unlawful practices comprehensively rather than one plaintiff at a time. By limiting relief to named parties, the court has shifted much of the burden of enforcement onto individuals and organizations willing and able to bring repeated lawsuits. Critics warn that this risks creating a system in which rights function as privileges for those with sufficient resources. Supporters respond that this approach respects constitutional limits and preserves the separation of powers. The decision does not resolve that debate, but it does set a new procedural baseline that will shape future litigation. In the end, this ruling represents a significant recalibration of judicial power. Federal law remains the same, but the mechanisms used to challenge and temporarily restrain that law have been fundamentally altered. Whether this change is viewed as a return to constitutional principles or as a fragmentation of legal protection depends on perspective. What is clear is that understanding the decision requires attention to legal reasoning, historical interpretation, and procedural design. As similar disputes arise in the coming years, the framework established here will influence not only what courts decide, but how and for whom those decisions take effect. Carrying that analytical lens forward provides a way to make sense of a legal landscape that is now more complex, more localized, and more consequential than before.